Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Today, we are here to talk about queering psychedelics and how the LGBTQ movement is playing into the broader psychedelic movement. My name is Shelby Clark. I am the founder of an LGBT-focused retreat center called the Jungle Gayborhood in Costa Rica. We just today finished hosting a group, a week-long retreat of 16 queer-identifying men in Costa Rica. And our experience has been that creating queer-specific containers to do this work is incredibly profound. And so I'm very honored to be joined by these three incredible practitioners in the space. So in terms of the format for the panel this morning, I'm going to start off by introducing each of the panelists, or I'm going to ask themselves to introduce themselves, show their background, their pronouns, and then I'll ask them a question. And then we'll zoom out, and we'll take a look at the broader queer psychedelics ecosystem from a couple different lenses. And then if we have a couple, we'll try to save some time at the end for questions from the audience. So first of all, let me ask, Justin, can you please introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, thanks for being here. I'm Justin Natoli, no pronouns refused. I am a psychotherapist, I am a psychedelic therapist, I serve with Tracruna on the Women, Gender, Diversity, and Sexual Minorities Working Group, and also founded the Queer Medicine Community, where we do workshops and retreats that are queer-focused and bring psychedelic healing to queer communities and queer medicine to psychedelic communities.
Beautiful. Justin, what is queer trauma, and what role do you see psychedelics playing in healing it?
So this is my understanding, and it might be different from yours, so I invite you to take what you like and leave the rest. To answer that question, I think it's important to expand the definition of queer somewhat. And so the dictionary defines queer as differing in some way from what is normal. And I hate that definition, because it basically baked into the definition of queerness is this idea that it's in opposition to what is normal. Well, I really like to take a more expanded definition of queer, which means that it shatters the illusion of normal altogether. It expands beyond all of those categories, turning binaries into spectrums. And so queerness not being anything necessarily related to gender or sexual orientation, but it's everything that doesn't fit neatly into these illusory categories. So light is queer. It's both a particle and a wave. It's two-spirited, right? And so from this definition, inside of each of us is a unique essence that has never existed before. It will never exist again. There's an indigenous psychoanalyst and author, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and she says in her oral tradition that there are three secrets. Secret number one, since you were born gifted, you will never lead an ordinary life. Secret number two, eccentricity is the first sign of giftedness. You are made one of a kind with all of your oddities. They are arrows pointing straight to your giftedness. Secret number three, if you are seeking to be normal, I hope you'll get over it. Normalcy is the enemy of giftedness. So this, right, this is your giftedness. This is your portal to source. This is the way that you can offer a gift to this world that desperately needs it, that is uniquely you. So queer trauma, then, from this category, is all of the ways that the overculture creates boxes for us to squeeze ourselves into, clip off the parts of ourselves that don't fit, and then in doing so, we lose touch with our own queer medicine. And this is a trauma. This is a trauma because not only are people who are holders of queer energy in a culture, and when I say holders, it means that people who are labeled as queer tell us more about the culture doing the labeling than the person holding the label as queer, right? So there's violence that's perpetrated against holders of queer energy. That's a trauma. There's shame and disconnection and excommunication associated, experienced by holders of queer energy. That's a trauma of shame, where we believe that our deepest medicine is actually a problem that needs to be fixed and hidden. That's a trauma. But even people who don't hold queer energy in a culture are traumatized by the overculture, are traumatized through queer trauma, because it shackles our imaginations. There's all these rules in different categories of our lives, rules about our bodies, rules about what a family is, about what relationships are, what sex can be, what gender is, right? And all of those rules act as shackles for our wildly expansive essences. And that in itself is a trauma because it shackles our imagination and it makes us so limited and so small. Well, this benefits the overculture greatly because by keeping us small, not only do we become hungrier and hungrier to fill the void of what has been cut out of ourselves, thus perpetuating this consumer-based, market-driven economy, it disconnects us and it just diminishes the entire planet. And so to heal queer trauma, psychedelics are really important because psychedelics are queer. They erase the categories. They erase the shackles that have been imposed on us by the overculture. They open our hearts so that we can go on that treasure hunt inside of us to find all those odd bits and pieces that are linked to our most unique medicine. And they also help create community. And because of the shame that's such a part of the queer experience, I think it's really important that we also acknowledge psychedelic community as a healing container where we can bring all of our unique gifts and recognize that we belong as part of the tribe.
Thank you, Justin. Whether identified as queer or not, does anyone here feel like they have some queer trauma to heal? Thank you all for doing this work. Clancy, can I turn to you, please?
Okay. You want me to introduce myself?
Yeah.
I'm Clancy Cavnar, and I'm a doctor of psychology. I work in private practice. I'm also I guess, 30-plus year member of Santo Daime, and I'm an artist as well. I co-founded Chacruna, which I am a co-founder, but Bia is not a co-founder. She's a founder, I'm a co-founder. So, and I'm also a lesbian, and I'm from New Jersey. I guess that's my introduction.
Awesome, thank you, Clancy. How does ayahuasca help the LGBT population accept and honor their identities?
Oh, well, I did my dissertation on gay people in ayahuasca and exactly that topic. Thank you for asking that question. In my research, I just found all 18 people, and I bet like so many hundreds of other people that I didn't get to interview, found that just like many people who drink ayahuasca who aren't queer, that they are sacred, holy beings that have intrinsic worth that has nothing to do with what other people think of them. And that's a very simple thing that everybody should discover for themselves, and that's what healing, that to me anyway, is what psychedelic healing is going to the core and throwing off all of those things, which what Jason's describing to me, I just kept saying, you mean the patriarchy? You mean the patriarchy? That's what's sinking into our consciousness. That's what's making us judge ourselves, judge other people, be afraid of, being weird or being afraid of being caught being gay. Like, just that feeling that I think, I don't know currently, but when I was a teenager, like, that was a horrible thing that I didn't think I was gay because I would not want to be that, and I was already having enough social problems. I didn't need, to be, so that intrinsic personal hate that comes from just who you are. And I think a lot of other people have that. It's true for different racial groups that are told that they're shit or whatever. All the groups that we're talking about here that are marginalized are all marginalized by the patriarchy and told, if you're not fitting into here, if you're not like a thin blonde woman with whatever qualities, or as it goes down the triangle, then at the bottom are all the people that have been really kicked out. And in our culture in America, we're not so kicked out. We're allowed to do pretty much anything, become senators and things like that. Maybe not president, but we're not so rejected. But in some countries, like Uganda, where you will be killed, or you're recommended to be stoned to death by, that's real and that's really happening. And so I feel very badly for all the queer people in those countries. And here, it's still a struggle, and I think the struggle really here is in families that are unhappy that they discovered that you're queer. And even if it's just a disappointment, it's still like such a bad feeling to feel like, oh, like, it's really horrible. So I think psychedelics just can show you that light and show you that other people, maybe they can't see that light. And the people who especially can't see the light are the people who can't see that light in themselves. So really the people who need to be taking psychedelics but then again, we found that does not cure being a jerk.
Hallelujah.
So I guess it's important for queer people to take it, to discover their own beauty, and that their beauty is equal to the beauty of everybody else, and it's super beautiful.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for doing this. And thank you for starting that research on the impact of ayahuasca on the LGBT community. There'll be another study later this year by Unlimited Sciences looking into this. I think it's really important to continue this research on it, so exciting to see that happening. And Stephanie, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
No. Yeah, no, maybe? Yes. Thank you. I'm Dr. Stephanie Michael Stewart, and I am multiracial, Black, white, Native American, queer, cisgender, able-bodied, dual citizen, holistic psychiatrist, and a mom of 2, age 7 and 2. For work, I'm proud to be the newest member of the Racial Equity and Access Committee at Chacruna. And yes, thank you. I have a small private practice based here in San Francisco, and I also work with a group in LA working with neurologists and therapists and patients with severe mental illness with ketamine, doing partial hospitalization programming and an intensive outpatient therapy. I live in Canada, I'm not licensed there, so I do a lot of community organization and social justice work around psychedelics. And then I am helping to implement centers for psychedelic therapies and research at historically Black medical schools in the US. And thank you. And my new creative project that I'm very excited about is installing experiential ecological art pieces. So my work specifically focuses on ecological medicine, plant medicine, women's health, and talking about childbirth as a psychedelic experience, and social justice. I said psychological experience, didn't I? Psychedelic experience. Birth is a psychedelic experience.
What are red and green flags that we can educate folks to look out for in groups or providers that would alert a client of a true understanding of the queer experience in the psychedelic space?
Yeah, important to look for the red flags, green flags. I think off the bat, there's some that are pretty easy to spot. Using terms that are outdated, really not respecting pronouns, not understanding what your identity means at all. If you're asexual and they just don't understand what that is, don't respect, like neopronouns is a great test of, but I think, underneath that, it's just really important that a provider or a space gets how difficult and traumatic it is to grow up, as you said, Clancy, in a homophobic family structure. That's a specific kind of trauma. And, in other marginalized identities, for the most part, well, racially anyway, you share that with your family. And so there's this alienation that's very specific. And I think, it's also really important for a mental health provider in particular to really understand the mental illness in the context of oppression. Because if we're just looking at that from a biological perspective and kind of putting that on the patient, you have this issue, like the way we define depression in the face of oppression really dictates whether, that system of oppression is seen or it's just sort of dismissed and it's back, kind of blaming the victim, so to speak, like it's on that person, it's individualizing, it's pathologizing. And, anything that, it's not uncommon that if a group or a provider doesn't understand something, they're going to pathologize it. So, green flags would be some of the opposite. It takes some time to get to know a provider. I don't think they specifically have to be queer themselves, but do need to understand and have the capacity to have a relationship where rupture and repair can happen. But of course, if someone prefers to have a provider who's queer and have access to that, then by all means. But I think that those are some important things to look for.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at the queer psychedelic movement from a couple different lenses. So we'll start off taking a macro view, just looking at sort of what's going on in the landscape. And then for the practitioners in the space, we'll take a lens looking at them, like what can providers be thinking about. And then finally for queer people who may be looking to experience psychedelic movement themselves, what can they do? So first of all, for the queer psychedelic movement as a whole, what are the most important changes and developments happening, and how can we increase inclusivity for the queer community in the psychedelic movement?
Yeah, can you say the question again?
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so for the queer psychedelic movement as a whole, what are the most important changes and developments happening, and how can we increase inclusivity for the queer community in the psychedelic movement?
I'm not sure about the most important changes that are happening. Maybe someone else can speak to that, but I think access, really, for inclusivity, it's so expensive to obtain psychedelic therapies. And also, I think one of the routes that is being neglected that's particularly important for queer people is the community element of psychedelic therapies. Right now, it's really being researched primarily as an individual person receiving the therapy from one or more therapists. We're just now starting to see maybe some group work, and that helps increase access just by making it more affordable, but I think it's really neglecting that the community is as much of a transmitter of the healing of psychedelic therapy as is the mystical experience, at least when it comes to queer people, in my opinion. Because as a part of that queer trauma, it's because we start to believe that we don't belong in community exactly as we are. And so some of the greatest healing that I've seen in psychedelic spaces comes as part of the community aspect where, I can bring my gifts here, and my gifts matter, and my gifts make this experience better for the community. And then also, the kind of fairy godmother perspective of, we also get to see other people fully embodied in their queer medicine, and that makes me inspired to see what I have inside of me. And so that aspect, I think, is really lost in the way that psychedelic therapy is currently being researched. And so I think affordability and then also integrating this community aspect, which I do think means recognizing that one queer part of psychedelic therapy right now is the underground, right? And so I think the underground has so much value to add to this conversation, particularly with queer people, because it's the underground that the queer people went to for salvation and for protection against the overculture. And so if we don't honor the wisdom of the underground and find pathways so that these like really qualified, wise practitioners can join the conversation and participate in the healing without risking their freedom, then we're really neglecting something important.
I just want to point out for Chikrina's Queering Psychedelic conferences that that's just a sign of like more people, and I think all the things spread from there. There's retreats and other things specifically for queer people. And it's interesting because this is like a medical treatment kind of, and it's one of the first times I've seen like such an emphasis on, and I'm not saying like the whole world is doing this, but I have noticed, and like MAPS has taken it into consideration. I've spoken at several conferences. We have also about getting queer people into being able to access the medicines. And so I feel like for whatever reason, because it's such a psychological treatment, I think that you have to take these things into consideration. And it's nice to see. It would be great if they started considering like with SSRIs and other things, like how does that fit into your identity as a queer person? And of course, those aren't going to have such a huge effect on how you're thinking about it, but I'm hopeful, and I see, at least in the United States, and like the northern, western people are being more inclusive and recognizing it, and I think it's because people are speaking out and, publishing about it and thinking about it in public, and people, I hope there's some straight people in the audience that are also paying attention that this group is a special group psychologically, especially because of the very thing that you were saying, that in our families we can be rejected, whereas like if you're whatever race or ethnic group that's being rejected, you can turn to your parents and say, this is horrible, and they'll say, we know. And if you're gay and you say, this is horrible, they'll say, get out the door and go, find someplace else to live. So I'm hopeful that people are talking more about the influence of sexual orientation and gender on treatments, especially psychological treatments like psychedelics.
Yeah, I just want to add to that the once access is achieved, that the psychological component, the therapy is so important, because if the therapist is untrained, incompetent, straight up hateful, they'll do much more harm than good, especially under psychedelic medicine influence and altered states of consciousness. And then I also wanted to add, when you mentioned research, that I feel like research is so important because the way that it's done really, tells a story about what's important, what's not important, and however that's laid out is what's going to be picked up and how it's rolled out, because that's what's proven to work. And so this is just kind of sets the way forward, and so we really have to look at inclusivity in research.
And also, I just want to add one thing to that, is the comfort of the therapists themselves with their own sexuality, even if they're queer, because some people have weird ideas, or it's hard to tell, but that's very crucial, is if your provider has strange ideas about gender or sexuality that don't match yours, and during some psychedelic experience, if they try to insert those, I think that's like doubly or triply harmful.
Absolutely. Well, it's a great segue to my next question. For the providers in the audience, what advice do you have for psychedelic therapy providers or therapists in general on how to work with a queer client? Be nice.
I think first is like acknowledging it and not acting like it's nothing. And I've seen so many intake forms that don't ask. They ask gender, and then they get specific about all and other gender, but they don't ask sexual orientation. And I think that's a question that is a very valid and should be primal to all intakes for psychological services, and inviting people to talk about it. Like, it's not something that we talk about later because I'm not comfortable with you yet, or you're not comfortable with me. It's like, so just bring it out and find out, get all of the, like, these are very salient details, more than many others. So I think that just being open to talking about it, and then letting people know that you're aware that this could make a difference in their treatment. And like putting up, I've said this before, and some people said, oh, that's so, I don't know if people agree, but I think putting like gay flag decals on your door and like a sign that says everybody here is welcome or something like that, I know for myself that like that's a little bit of a, okay, these people aren't going to be awful to me. So just doing I think it's pretty much the bare minimum of letting people know that you're not going to hate on them is important.
Agree with all that. And let me think of this out loud first before making this like a final declaration. But I don't know if practitioners ought to be working with any queer people until they've gone through their own queer journeys. Because even if a person is cisgendered or heterosexual, they still have a queer journey to go on, because they still have absorbed the rules and the shackles of what gender can be, a body can be, families can be, sex can be, love can be. There's still these shackles inside of them. And until someone has really gone on a journey of taking off the shackles altogether and piece by piece discovering, in my own unique way, what is sex? In my own unique way, what is a family? In my own unique way, what is love? Right? Until somebody does that, then we are going to implicitly or explicitly impose those shackles on somebody else.
I was going to say similar, but you said it better. Yeah, I think I would also add to that. Well, it stems from that, right? But what came to mind is this over-assigning queerness to mental illness, assuming that that's why you're here, and realizing that queer people have a broad range of experience beyond that piece of identity. And so there can be like levels of inappropriate questioning and just digging in when it's not really about, like, that's not, why I came to you. But, so yeah, it is an aspect of doing that work yourself as a practitioner.
All right, thank you all. And now for the queer people in the audience, and I guess by Justin's definition, almost everybody could be queer. What should queer people know about how they can access the psychedelic movement, factoring in some of these challenging issues about access, different levels of access? And what resources can queer people find, and why are they important?
Well, there are now queer retreats, and I think people can find them online. They can search for them. I'm just going to speak to Santo Daime in the United States because it's what I'm a member of, and it's pretty accessible to people that would want to take psychedelics, but it's also a very patriarchal religion based on Christianity, and so that might be something that people would not like. So, but I just wanted to say that I found Santo Daime in the United States to be I never had a problem with anything, and I was always included in everything, and people have been super nice to me. So in those environments, and I think many times in the United States, you're going to find very welcoming circles of people, because people who take psychedelics, usually in the United States, are like more open-minded, hippie-like people. There are certainly weirdos that are dangerous. But in general, I don't find that the groups that I've gone to have ever made me feel bad about being queer. So I think most of them are welcoming. I don't know how. I guess people usually go to these groups because they know someone who knows someone. So finding out about it that way would also be a way to see if it was, queer friendly. But I just like to encourage. I like to encourage everybody to take drugs, but I like to encourage queer people in particular to take psychedelics, and I would say in particular ayahuasca, because it's just super healing, and I think it addresses, in my dissertation, it directly addressed people's harms from homophobia. So I hope people aren't put off by, I don't know. And I also know that in Latin America, there's a lot more homophobia that's on the surface and embedded in things. So I would be more cautious about the providers in those countries. But there's a lot of nice ones as well. And a lot of the retreats are run by Americans. So there's that. So I hope that queer people will access these psychedelics if they can. Do it.
Anything to add? I guess following up on that, Justin, you facilitated a retreat for queer identifying people. Can you share anything about that experience and how that may have been different than non-queer retreats that you may have been a part of in the past?
Yeah, so one thing I do is I facilitate legal plant medicine retreats for queer people. And I've found that these queer experiences, participants are really appreciative to have this container because there's just a comfort level, right? Where you can, we have different layers, like an onion of the different levels of queerness inside ourselves that we feel safe bringing out. And so I think in a queer space, we just feel comfortable exploring deeper into those layers. I also bring, in my retreats, I bring just lots of different outfits and makeup and all sorts of things for people to just experiment and explore beyond their traditional kind of comfort zone or beyond their traditional habits, just to see okay, what does gender mean to you? And what does, right, maybe you do want to try this sparkly muumuu, for today and just see how that feels on your body. And I feel like people feel safer to explore vulnerable aspects of themselves when they don't feel the eyes of the overculture watching over them.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a funny story from a retreat that we hosted recently. It was a queer retreat, and as people were entering the shala, there was a saging, and normally the saging is done by eagle or condor feathers, and so it was a psilocybin ceremony, so a little bit less of the. But anyways, so a fan, from a clacker fan was what was being used to sage people on the way in, and it made people feel comfortable. It was pretty funny.
I'll say one more thing, kind of off of that. I like how you bring in kind of queer culture into that space. This is my experience, and a lot of the people I know and work with also have this experience where even in our queer communities, we really spread our own wounds of the closet of exclusion, right, and hierarchy, and white privilege and body privilege and all of these things. And so even in our own communities, I think there's a real shadow element that recreates the queer traumas that many of us grew up with. And so this different type of intentional community, I think people find that they really appreciate a chance to get together in a way that isn't organized around sex, that isn't organized around the ways that people traditionally create hierarchies, in queer communities, and it's really much needed medicine to be able to have a beloved community, right, where everyone gets to be involved rather than recreating what fighting for crumbs of love as though it's the Hunger Games, right? Because it's a scarce commodity rather than treating love as abundant that we all get to share to each other. So I think it actually helps heal the trauma in the queer communities themselves by being able to relate to each other in these more open, loving ways.
Absolutely. I'd also like to open up to the audience. If there's any questions, you can come out and and ask the panelists. Do we have a microphone to?
Well, I think that it's interesting, just the framing of it, queering psychedelics. My understanding and my lived experience is that psychedelics are inherently queer. And what I see happening now is that people who are queer themselves are the people who are funding the science. In 2019, I came to this conference. Goddess bless you and Bia for making this conference, because I came after years of looking for where's queer psychedelics, and I met Chris Stauffer, who's running a lab that focuses on queer research for queer people, right? So you know this, the SNAP lab in Oregon just finished the first MDMA study for traumatized veterans who had sexual trauma from while they were in the military, and they got a DEA exception to do that. So rather than like going, oh, are we gonna inform or include, we are it. We are the generative, chthonic, dark cunt of erotic life force.
Woo!
Right? So we don't have to wait to be included. We just need to recognize each other and support each other when they come, when the fading Uber culture tries to extinguish us, because what we're creating is the living love revolution, and that's why we're here, you know? So if you know other people, mostly I'm just here, I want to talk to other people who are doing similar things. You can recognize me by my queer hairdo, right? Especially if you're running a psychedelic mystery cult in the underground, I want to know you so we can support each other. Okay? Thank you.
Are there any other questions? In the back.
Thank you. I want to recognize the importance of this topic, and I want to thank every single one of you for naming what has not been named for many generations, I believe, because we are the survivors. We are the ones that have been excluded from society, and here we are now having a chance to not just survive, but actually live. And it is through psychedelics that we get to reclaim our indigeneity, or history of why we're here. And I think one of the things that because yes, there's not a lot of accessibility for us. We're still having to fight to have these spaces, and sometimes just the courtesy of other people to recognize us as sacred beings. It takes a lot. And in that, I also noticed that there is this word of safe spaces. And I believe that you can create a safe space, but the word of safe space is just the container is safe, but whoever comes in, we cannot control how they're gonna react to the medicine, how they're gonna react to others being freely themselves. And that sometimes can bring a mirror that it's uncomfortable to watch. But I do question, if instead of naming or striving to create sacred, safe spaces, can we create sacred space to recognize our sacred divinity without questioning what sex, what gender? Like, I think there is a really powerful way that we can reclaim our spaces in a sacred relationship, and naming these places not as safe, but as sacred, so that we kind of battle against this illusion of separation. Because a safe container could also bring malintended people. And I think that some of the risks that we as queer people, when we are in ceremony, when we're in these spaces, we sometimes are also harmed because other people's projections or other people's work. And I feel like in this type of reclamation for our medicine, we deserve the very least to be acknowledged as sacred beings. without being questioned. Thank you.
I just want to make a short comment on collaborating on the panel. I want to bring back, I opened up yesterday talking again about psychedelic culture and what is the future of the psychedelic movement. And I, see this conference not just as a conference, but as movement building and helping advance an intellectual and political agenda for the field of psychedelic. And we are claiming that culture is fundamental and culture is the cement of everything, and it's underneath everything. And it talks about the question that Ernesto was saying about us self-regulating. It talks about this panel. What is underneath all of this is culture, and this informal means of controls, our values, our norms, our social behavior, our connection to each other, our protocols, our etiquette, our sensitivity, our spirit, the way we understand, like when you're invited in somebody's house, there's a way to behave. You offer a drink, you sit, you welcome. Like there's ways to be in society, there's ways to relate. This, people, is called culture. And this is how we behave. It's not just because of rules, it's not just because of religious dogma, it's not just because of biomedical values, it's not just because of criminal law enforcement, it's because of values, of things we believe in, and we're educated, and we get knowledge. And all of this is completely fundamental for us in society, and we need to cultivate these values, and that's what we're doing here. And when we talk about who's going to regulate psychedelic use, it's us, by our own values, by being good behavior, by showing up correctly, because if you don't, it looks bad for you. And people are going to say, woo, what's that weird person doing? Don't do that. That's not how you do it. And that is not going to be a DEA bureaucrat sitting somewhere trying to cook up an idea. It's not going to be Congress passing a law. It's us, the people, creating self-regulation, informal, cultural means of control that are passed on by generations and generations and generations and are socialized. And that's why we need to create this culture with certain values that accommodates queer people, that, have a nice way to bring in diversity and an etiquette. And maybe it's messy, and maybe you don't know how to do it, and maybe you feel strange, but then you ask and you learn, and maybe you do it wrong, and then you feel bad, but then next time you're doing it better. And we're co-creating it together as communities, as societies, and that is why we call this psychedelic culture. And it's up to us as psychedelic movements to self-regulate. And that includes, yes, bad-mouthing people that are doing things in the wrong way. And, calling in, if you see a practitioner that is being abusive, that is taking advantage of other people, or that is being a racist, or that is being homophobic, you call that out. So it's just an invitation for all of us to co-create this psychedelic culture that will influence the future of this movement. And I want to say modestly that I think it works. I do have hope. For example, Queen Psychedelics, when we first created it, it was a kind of like really exotic niche audience that, came from the Woodstocks, and it was a full auditorium of people, and it was vibrant. And in that next year, we saw like dozens of circles of queer people. Chikrin didn't invent queer people, Chikrin didn't invent psychedelics, but we helped catalyze to the surface something latent that exists. And this is very spread, and mainstream conferences have queer spaces now, and it's bad taste not to have any. And it's happening, and the same is going to happen with religion. We also did this Religious Freedom Restoration Act guidelines and best practices. So many groups are self-organizing and passing knowledge, downloading to each other, and communities are organizing. We do workshops, and dozens of people show up. There's a hunger for that knowledge. So all of this is completely doable. It is up to us, and yet it continues to have, recognition and funding and the powers to be continue to marginalize culture, which is what brings all of us together. So hopefully this conference is another step, to create this future that we believe in.
Are we out of time?
Yeah, we're at time if you want to have any final comments.
No, just thank you so much for the space here. Thank you, Pia, for that call to arms and for creating the space. And thank you for the panelists for doing your work and for sharing your perspective.
Yeah, give it up for our panel.